doing. You know, I don't want to risk my dopamine, so I guess I just better shut up and let him, do things. It's like, I started to really think about that, and once it gets into your head, it's like you start to realize the different things that you do in your life that, are basically motivated by dopamine in one way or another.
Oh yeah. It becomes it becomes quite shocking to realize how much of a wrong direction you're going in. I mean, I found that when it was a similar thing when I watched the 3-hour video on YouTube by Marshall Rosenberg, the lecture for nonviolent communication, and just watching that and thinking back to the kind of things that I say to people a lot of the time, and I'm like, Jesus Christ, there's quite a lot of jackal language in some of the things I say. So it's sort of making that realization does enable you to change patterns of behavior, just like with recognizing, what you do for dopamine, just for the sake of the dopamine itself, not necessarily for the effectiveness or the benefit of actually doing the action itself, whether it will whether it will benefit someone else or a group of people, or whether it will just benefit yourself. And I've definitely found that as an activist, how I think that a lot of people in my life are probably more happier for the kind of things that I do, because the amount of things that I would do just for the sake of helping someone else are actually lower than they would be now. I mean, even on the way to the pub this evening, I was walking up the road, and there was a car that had pulled out because there was sort of like a blind driveway that they were coming out of, and they were edging out onto a main road. I knew that they weren't able to see up the road to see if there were any cars coming the other way. So instead of, because he'd actually stopped and given me enough space to walk around him and carry on my way, but instead I stood there looking up the road to basically just beckon him on, say, yeah, it's clear. So and he gave me a thumbs up as he went past, and I didn't think anything of it. That sort of thing I probably wouldn't have done before I became an activist. I mean, it makes me sound like a real asshole, but
well, right. But it's good to say though, however, that okay, there are certain things that give you dopamine rushes that are quite positive, and one of them is that good feeling that you can cultivate from helping other people, and that has a benefit too. It's like, even in a completely supposedly self-absorbed or regulated point of view, being altruistic has benefits to your immediate survival. Because if you live in a world where people are altruistic, then people are more likely to be altruistic to you when you need it. If you're in a group of people and you help somebody, you even see this sometimes in the animal kingdom. There are animals that will help other animals. Yeah. And that's basically, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that the big thing that humans have to do, especially since we're supposed to be an advanced species, is recognize when we're doing things for dopamine addiction and when we're doing things, that are harmful for dopamine addiction rushes. I think that's essentially what I would get at. You can cultivate your enjoyment of helping people till the cows come home. That's a good idea as long as you're not allowing yourself to be taken advantage of. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that it is a matter of just recognizing the difference there. There is that inherent recognition that what you do for other people does serve you, but that would be termed as selfishness, I think. Mm-hmm. Is that the term?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And and I'd say that those sort of things do contribute towards the betterment of society, because it enables people to relax a little bit. I mean, they, like, say for example, that individual who was edging out of their driveway. Say for example, if they were an individual who maybe in the past had been edging out of that driveway and got hit by a lorry or something, and have maybe some sort of residual anxiety about the very act of having to edge out of a driveway. So that very act of helping them has alleviated a potential anxiety in that person. So it all accumulates. So the very act of doing things just to help other people, whether you acknowledge the dopamine benefit for yourself or not, it's still a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah,
I guess, no, it's just, I knew you had questions to ask. Was there anything that you wanted to move on to, or did you get enough insight about my life as an activist?
One of the things that is quite tentative, and I think one thing that I don't think enough activists talk about is how being an activist impacts like intimate relationships or romantic relationships. I mean, I personally, I've come to the conclusion that I can't date a woman who is asleep. I can't go back to that, because it just creates, in my own personal experience, it's created far too much tension and far too much conflict. So I don't necessarily need to be with someone who is also a zeitgeister, to use that term, but at least someone who recognizes the problems and doesn't patronize me for it. I've seen girls recently, and hanging out with them, and we things will come up in conversation, and I'd make a little statement that would just stand on its own, that wouldn't be aggressive or encouraging of any further discussion, just like a simple idle statement that would be insightful, but then the girl would just be like, yeah, sort of thing, and even patronize me to an extent, and I just can't stand that. If someone is willing to actually share an optimistic and charitable insight about how we can make this world a better place, then it shouldn't be patronized. And having that conflict in a romantic situation, it's not good for either of the partners. So, even though I've gone off on a huge tangent there, what would you have to say in regards to how a progressive thinking mind versus a non-progressive thinking mind, how has that played out?
When it comes to, you mean just as far as like choosing a mate for oneself, or?
Well, not just that, but also, like, say for example, like when I first became an activist, I was already in a relationship, and I think that relationship in particular did suffer because that woman did become used to me being a certain way, and then because I encountered this information, I seemed to change, and she definitely didn't like that, because even though women do generally like a change in their man, but only generally if it's a change that they want and that they've encouraged. Not to sound sexist or anything, but it's just something.
Well, no, it's. In a lot of cases, depending on what age group you're talking about, girls are encouraged culturally not to get involved in things like that. I've had these conversations with activist women, for example, like Brandy Hume. You know, two questions that I asked was, you know, because people asked, you know, why are there not more African American people in the Zeitgeist movement? And I talked to Brandy and I talked to EJ, who have both been on my show. You know, EJ in particular, I was like, you know, why do you think there are not more black men in the Zeitgeist movement? And he's like, he says it's not a matter of, he says it's a cultural thing overall in that generally black people don't sit in front of computers. He's like, you know, we play console games. He's like, it's not that we're not capable of learning how to operate a computer. He says, but generally, you know, and the funny thing is he's absolutely right. When I lived in the ghetto, not just, you know, whenever I visit black friends, but you just don't see very many home computers when you live in that area. I mean, not even just because people couldn't afford them. It's that it's not
lives of their own.
Yeah, well, between that and the fact that, I mean, it's a different world, and in that world, people don't sit around at computers all day. And the same thing is mostly true of women. I mean, you know, people ask, why are there not as many women? I'm like, well, it's not that women don't use computers, but do they sit around doing things with computers the same way that men do? You know, and culturally, they generally don't. You know, and that's starting to change, and I think that that's good. And it's not due to, once again, it's not due to any lack of ability. It's that currently, socially, it's just not, you know, what you see. And the funny thing is this isn't really true in other countries. You know, so once again, it's not a racial thing. That's why I said African Americans. Like, I talk to black people from, say, Africa all the time about activist stuff. You know, with them, you're not going to see them as much just because there's just not as many computers in that country, period. But, you know, their cultures are definitely a lot more aware of things like corruption and all of that. You know, and the same thing would be true of Hispanics, for example. You know, maybe you don't see a lot of Hispanic Americans, but the Mexico chapter of the Zeitgeist movement is huge. You know, the South American chapters are all really big. You know, so it's definitely just a cultural thing. But as far as, like, you know, it relating to them, you know, I can say, for example, that I mean, I myself am kind of in a transitional phase of trying to figure out what I want to do so far as relationships, because things are definitely a lot more complicated for yourself when you're divorced and you have kids of your own and stuff like that. And, you know, although the male gender is the one that supposedly always gets the reputation for not wanting to date people that already have kids, you know, I've met a lot of girls who say, you know, I really like you a lot and I'd like to date you, but I don't think I can become involved with someone who already has children. So that's definitely what I would say is a bipartisan problem.
Yeah.
You know, definitely. but besides that, I mean, I think the word I would use is socially conscious. So, you know, like, for example, there were girls that I met when I was hanging out with the Occupy movement who weren't necessarily Zeitgeist movement members, but I still felt like they would be more suitable for me just because they actually cared about any of this stuff. Yeah. Even if they don't agree with it the same way. Like, you know, for example, one of my ex-girlfriends was a Democrat, and while she you know, didn't agree with everything that I said as far as the Zeitgeist movement, it didn't bother me because at least she did care about these things, you know, and she listened to me, and, you know, I did change her around on a few things. Like, for example, she stopped being a Hillary Clinton person and instead became a Dennis Kucinich person, you know. So if you had to choose between Democrats, I don't know how familiar you are with American politicians, but Dennis Kucinich is the one that tried to impeach Bush and Cheney. You know, he's kind of like a Ron Paul person for the Democratic Party. And they could never get rid of him because he was the mayor of Cleveland and was very popular, and his constituency loved him, so they just kind of removed his district. That's the only way they could get rid of him. But anyway, you know, but I think that, you know, the funny thing is that when I talk to people about this stuff, like, even my friends who don't normally talk about these kinds of things go, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We should do that. You know, they're not necessarily going to go to meetings and start passing out flyers, but I don't generally get a negative reaction from the average layman when it comes to, you know, talking about Zeitgeist movement or resource-based economy principles. Because the funny thing is, when you're talking to people who are not very political, who are not already brainwashed into one idea or another, it's a lot easier just to come